We'll get started, and thanks for joining us. This is the Kirby Institute seminar series, and I'm Tanya Applegate, and I'll be hosting. I have the great honour of hosting this session, so thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continuing connection to culture, land, waters, and community. For myself and others here at the Kirby offices today, we're meeting on the land of the Aboriginal people. I would like to also pay my respects to elders, both past, present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today. We felt it was really important to note that this week marks the 15th anniversary, actually, of the National Apology to Stolen Generations. So we would also like to honour all elders across the nations and the families, communities, and generations that have suffered. So with that beginning, before we get started, I would just to give you some housekeeping. So the format of the seminar is it will start off with a presentation. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, followed by Q&A at the end. So feel free to put questions in as you think of them throughout, and we'll try and curate them at the end into some themes. And there'll be, you can click to do that. You can just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and then just type in your question. So with all of that, we'll get started. I'd like to introduce Heather McCormack. Heather is a Wiradjuri woman with 15 years experience as a health communication specialist in sexual health and blood-borne virus sector. And she's currently a PhD student at the Kirby as well. So Heather works as a senior program manager at New South Wales STI Programs Unit at New South Wales Health. And together, this unit brings together all the digital communication tools and strengths-based health promotion tools to improve sexual health outcomes for Aboriginal young people and other priority populations. So I'm going to now hand over to Heather, if you would, to have your presentation. We're very much looking forward to this presentation, Heather. I know I've heard snippets of it before, and I know it's very exciting and something that people definitely will learn a lot from and get people thinking. So thanks, Heather, over to you.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm Heather McCormack. As Tanya said, I am a PhD candidate at the Kirby Institute and a senior program manager at the New South Wales STI Programs Unit. I'm also a Wiradjuri woman. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present of Bidjigal Nation, where I'm dialing in from today, and also to the elders past and present of the nations you're all dialing in from. And I extend those respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the call today. If I can just share my screen. I think that's working. So today I'm going to talk about strengths-based approaches to Aboriginal sexual health, and I'm using the Take Blaktion program as a bit of a case study to show you what I mean by that. Next slide. Why aren't you working? So I'm going to be talking a bit about using comedy to break down stigma and shame, and how a successful sexual health promotion campaign can be grounded in just the right mix of culture and dick jokes. I'm going to use the Take Blaktion program as a case study, which means that you get to see some of the skit videos that we've published in recent years. So Take Blaktion was established to address disparities in sexual health outcomes for Aboriginal young people. And everyone who's dialing in today would be familiar with the concept of the gap in Aboriginal health outcomes. And the gap is also really frequently referenced in Aboriginal sexual health. Aboriginal young people have a higher prevalence of STIs than the general public, and the reasons for this are complex. Some of it is simply living in communities with high rates of STIs. So when young people have sex, they're more likely to come into contact with STIs, even if their behaviour isn't overly high risk. The landmark Goanna study has examined sexual behaviours of Aboriginal young people since 2014 and found that the median age of sexual debut is around 15, and around 40% of young people report consistent condom use. So that's not too dissimilar from non-Aboriginal young people. Early findings from our own research conducted by the STI Programs Unit as part of our festivals project show that Aboriginal young people attending events are more likely to report a new partner in the last 3 months and less likely to report condom use. But what we think is more significant is that they're less likely to report that they think their friends use condoms. Social norms like this are an important influence on sexual behaviour. And we also know from previous work that shame and stigma are major barriers to use of condoms and access to sexual health services for Aboriginal young people. So for these and other reasons, Aboriginal people are a priority population in all of the New South Wales STI and blood-borne virus strategies. And a need was identified for an Aboriginal-led campaign that would genuinely engage Aboriginal young people to deliver health promotion aligned with all the important strategies to empower Aboriginal young people to take charge of their sexual health. But do you see what I did there? It's what most people do when they're introducing a presentation about Aboriginal health, even one that's ostensibly about a successful program. I described the problem and I framed it by comparing Aboriginal young people to a presumably neutral non-Indigenous baseline. Throughout this presentation, I'm hoping to just get you thinking a little about why we do this and whether there's a better way. And as I said in my introduction, I'm going to use the Take Blaktion program as a case study. My broad point is that discussions about Aboriginal health and about Aboriginal people in the context of health often use a deficit lens. And by that, I mean they focus really heavily on the negatives. We talk about the gap and we talk about health disparities and we talk about Indigenous disadvantage. Research conducted on Aboriginal populations focuses on the problems within communities. And this research then contributes to an epidemiological framing that suggests that ill health is something inherent to Aboriginal people, that Aboriginality itself is a causative factor for disease and disadvantage. This framing isn't invisible to the populations that we're researching or working with. Aboriginal young people hear a lot about how disproportionately affected they are by all sorts of negative things. When we focus too hard on disease and disadvantage, we overlook the strengths of people and communities that could be health promoting or salutogenic. And when health promoting strengths within a community are not visible to researchers, they're also made invisible to policymakers who are using research to inform programs and services. This means that the public health activities that are ostensibly intended to reduce health disparities may in fact reinforce and replicate this deficit view of Aboriginal people and communities. So let me pause for a moment to introduce Take Blaktion properly. Take Blaktion launched in 2015 and it ran until 2017 and then went on hiatus for 2 years before returning in 2019. It's the flagship New South Wales sexual health promotion program targeting Aboriginal young people, and it's delivered as a partnership between the New South Wales STI Programs Unit and the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales, or AHMRC. The core components of Take Blaktion are high-profile comedy ambassadors who produce comedy sketch videos and activations at key community events. And often when I present this program to a largely non-Indigenous audience, I mean, I can't see you guys, but often when I present this program to a largely non-Indigenous audience, I see some eyebrows go up when I say that the core of the program is comedy. But comedy has a really long history in Aboriginal media. There is a uniquely Aboriginal humour across written fiction, theatre, comedy skit shows like ABC Black Comedy, where some of our ambassadors first hit the public eye. When it's used effectively, humour can circumvent shame and diffuse the discomfort that surrounds sensitive topics. To put simply, it's sometimes easier to talk about these topics if you can have a laugh about them. We engaged Aboriginal young people in the planning and design of the campaign from the start, and they were extremely clear about wanting to see something that made them feel good about themselves and their choices. Take Blaktion explicitly aims to avoid a deficit lens and instead adopts a strengths-based approach to challenge deficit narratives and encourage alternative strategies for addressing health issues. I'll share an example of Take Blaktion Creative. So this video is from 2017, pre-hiatus, and it stars campaign ambassadors Bjorn Stewart, Carly Wallace, Maddie Shields, and Ian Zaro. The early messaging of the campaign was quite simple, and it aimed to normalise talking about sexual health by situating the videos in online spaces where young people were communicating with their friends. I really hope this plays with audio.
This money ain't big enough for the both of us.
You? Didn't I see you at the last fork?
Yeah, you did. And I'm taking over this hole too.
Don't you know who I am? I'm the highest rate of infection in this town.
Oh, sorry. Just me syphilis spreading my way to the mouth. I'ma just let you do your business.
You both got it wrong. This hole's my turf.
So in my work, the simplest application of the principles of strengths-based approaches has involved consciously trying to avoid language and framing that makes people feel bad about themselves, and instead engaging people to think creatively about their own health and the health of their communities. But strengths-based approaches are not a uniform set of rules for policy or program development, and adopting a strengths-based approach doesn't automatically guarantee that a program is free of a deficit lens. In a resource I come back to again and again in my attempts to embed a strengths-based approach in my research and practice, Fogarty et al. Identified common themes invoked in literature when describing strengths-based approaches to Aboriginal health. Among others, these included a focus on community assets and resilience, cultural appropriateness, empowerment, holistic approaches, and salutogenesis. That word, salutogenesis, was also on an earlier slide, and it means focusing study on the origins and enabling of health. Basically, it means asking what makes people healthy rather than focusing on disease and risk factors. A strengths-based approach to Aboriginal health is an approach that acknowledges, respects, and embraces the strengths and assets of communities and cultures. Meaningful engagement with Aboriginal people and communities is often put forward as a strategy to ensure that programs are culturally appropriate, and that's not incorrect. But I would argue it doesn't go far enough. A strengths-based approach to Aboriginal health is Aboriginal-led. It conceives of Aboriginal people not only as participants, patients, and data points, but as leaders, researchers, public health practitioners, clinicians, and policymakers. The deficit framing I've discussed is often invisible to non-Indigenous researchers and policymakers. And as such, it's extremely important to have Aboriginal insight into designing analysis focused on Aboriginal people, or into designing public health programs where Aboriginal people are a target population. So that brings us back to Take Blaktion. We credit the success of Take Blaktion thus far to Aboriginal involvement at every level. It is delivered as a partnership between New South Wales Health and the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales, and it is guided by a diverse advisory committee of frontline Aboriginal sexual health workers from across New South Wales. The assets are produced by an Aboriginal creative agency who have an incredibly solid understanding of Aboriginal young people as a target audience, and an Aboriginal young person is engaged as a consultant to produce organic content. The program uses Aboriginal community language to encourage Aboriginal young people to see it as something that's really for them. And the ambassadors are not only well known for their careers as performers, they are also well known as respected members of the Aboriginal community. So this is one of my favourite Take Blaktion videos from 2019, featuring ambassadors Stephen Oliver, Bjorn Stewart, and Carly Wallace, who had all been ambassadors in the first 2 years of the program and then returned for another go when we relaunched. When we relaunched, our messaging began to get a little more complex. The calls to action was still to use condoms and get tested, but we began to weave in ideas about not getting carried away in the moment and not using condoms, as well as some messaging about how many STIs don't have symptoms and it's important to test even if everything seems fine.
Yeah.
If you're mother looking for some interaction, the kind that bring love satisfaction, take a moment before you take action. Play it safe and take Blaktion. It ain't a joke when having a poke to risk an STI that can make you folk broke. So take a moment, think of what's spoken. Take Blaktion, be strong for folk.
What are you doing in our room?
Yeah, we're trying to have some alone time.
Hey! Take Blaktion. Wait, condoms. Get tested.
Get out!
Okay.
That was weird, eh?
Catchy tune though.
True, eh?
So Take Blaktion content centers on 6 key thematic pillars. The first 4, condoms, STI testing, community language, and comedy ambassadors, they've all been central to the program from the very beginning. The last 2, healthy relationships and female empowerment, were included in the 2019 revamp of the campaign following evaluation of the first 2 years of the campaign, and particularly feedback from young women collected as part of that evaluation. They wanted to see more content that integrated sexual health messaging into messaging about having healthy, respectful relationships more broadly. These content pillars inform the development of the skit videos that are central to the campaign. They inform the work done at our event activations, and we incorporate content into the organic content that we publish on our social media channels each month based on these content pillars. Importantly, the content pillars center strengths and assets that the Aboriginal young people in our target audience bring to their relationships. Earlier, I mentioned that it is common to see and hear Aboriginality framed as a risk factor for disease, in the sense of Aboriginal people are at higher risk of poorer health outcomes. So this purports to be an objective statement of fact, right? That on a population level, the negative health outcome in question occurs more frequently in Aboriginal people than in the non-Indigenous population. But it's not a neutral framing. When we describe Aboriginal status as a risk factor, the health gap and the wealth gap and the incarceration gap and the child removal gap are unconsciously framed as being inherently linked to Aboriginality itself. In this framing, Aboriginal people are poor due to being Aboriginal. Aboriginal people are at risk of ill health due to being Aboriginal. Aboriginal people are more likely to go to jail due to being Aboriginal. Aboriginal people will die young due to being Aboriginal, etc., and so forth. So we all know that the reality is obviously much more complex, but it's really difficult to escape this framing without running the risk of sounding like you're minimizing the role of intergenerational trauma and racism as structural determinants of health, or the way that structural and systemic marginalizations intersect around Aboriginal people and communities and affect our health. Unfortunately, there's no simple soundbite to share on Twitter as the key takeaway from my presentation that will cover such a nuanced issue. But I would argue that work that highlights Aboriginal status as a risk factor for negative outcomes without exploring those structural and systemic determinants is just missing a really large and important part of the picture. Oops, I've gone too far. It can be argued that exploration of health disparities affecting Aboriginal populations is in fact exploration of the population level impacts of racism and dispossession. But these factors are invisible in the majority of research and policy focused on Aboriginal people. When I say we should take a strengths-based approach, I don't mean ignore or avoid the negative outcome. In fact, often the correct approach is to dig deeper into it and make sure you're asking all the relevant questions. If Aboriginal people are disproportionately affected by a negative health outcome, explore why that is. Do other factors that correlate with Aboriginal status account for some or all of what you're seeing? Are those factors addressable in a way that who someone is not? Sometimes the strengths-based approach is about reorienting your work so you're revealing solutions instead of simply documenting deficit. So this video is from last year and features our ambassadors Megan Wilding, who returned for a second year, and newcomers Andy Saunders and Dale Woodbridge-Brown. Andy is a stand-up comedian and Dale is a circus performer, which opened the door for some really great physical comedy. Among others, they produced the Chicago homage, which went on to become one of the best performing assets we've ever done with our YouTube audience. The message is one that we've been using for a while. Don't be afraid to get tested. It's not scary. But the ambassadors use satire and pop culture references to communicate this in a really quick and cheeky way.
Pox. Crabs.
Chlamydia. Gono.
Syphilis.
Sandra.
That's me.
Oh, good. Well, follow me.
Go get tested, you mum. Don't make a big song and dance about it.
So I've been talking about health promotion so far, and strengths-based approaches to Aboriginal health are often associated with humanities, with health promotion, with qualitative research, and so on. But I want to just briefly note some really interesting work that's been done around strengths-based approaches to statistics in public health. In Australia, statistics about Aboriginal health are tightly bound up in association with government policies to close the gap, which is something I mentioned earlier. This discourse positions the non-Indigenous population as a neutral baseline and the Aboriginal population as comparatively deficient and in need of being brought up to the non-Indigenous standard. And I see two major problems with this. And the first is simply a technical problem. The non-Indigenous baseline isn't static, it's a moving target. A much greater investment goes into improving the health and longevity of the general population each year than goes into improving the health and longevity of Aboriginal populations specifically. What we're really saying when we say we want to close the gap in Aboriginal health outcomes is that we want to improve those outcomes for Aboriginal people faster and more effectively than we improve them for non-Indigenous people. From a practical perspective, that's just an extremely difficult goal for a program to meet without truly astronomical resourcing. And from an ontological perspective, it positions non-Indigenous Australians as normative, and Aboriginal people are defined by our failure to meet this norm standard. The second problem with the emphasis on the gap in Aboriginal health research is that focusing only on interpopulation comparisons means that we often miss improvements that are actually occurring within the Aboriginal population. So, for example, smoking rates in Aboriginal populations are often compared to smoking rates in non-Indigenous populations, which produces worrying statistics like Aboriginal people are 30% more likely to smoke than non-Indigenous people, and there's been no change in this proportion for 20 years. And this is estimated to account for 23% of the health gap, which is all very true and very worrying. But if you look at change over time within the Aboriginal population and intra-population analysis rather than using a non-Indigenous norm standard, we see that smoking prevalence among Aboriginal people has declined every year for the last 25 years, and the rate of decline is increasing more and more every year. One approach makes it look like current strategies are failing, but the other reveals that progress is actually being made. I popped a citation on the slide for a paper by Thurber et al. That illustrates some examples of taking a strengths-based approach to statistical analysis and demonstrates that it can be done without sacrificing statistical rigor. It's a paper that I found extremely useful in my own work. So this is how Nacho define the, you know who Nacho are, define Aboriginal health. Aboriginal health means not just the physical well-being of an individual, but refers to the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential as a human being, thereby bringing about the total well-being of their community. It is a whole of life view and includes the cyclical concept of life, death, death, life. Now, this might feel like it's getting a little deep for a program that's fundamentally about trying to get young people to use condoms and get regular STI checks, but I think it's important to reflect for a moment on the cultural standpoint of the audience we're engaging. I said earlier that Aboriginal young people hear a lot about how disproportionately affected they are by negative health outcomes. There is an inherent contradiction to framing a population as inherently diseased and disadvantaged, and then trying to counteract that by delivering health promotion that focuses on individual behaviours. So while it may not have been completely apparent viewing the campaign assets I've shown you in isolation and out of context, I need to emphasise that part of the strengths-based approach adopted by Take Blaktion means engaging with Aboriginal young people as members of a community. And that itself is a source of strength and resilience for Aboriginal people. We encourage people to make choices about safer sex practices, but we also encourage young people to consider the health of their partners and communities and think about those choices in the context of collective well-being. So I would love to end this keynote by listing some dot points on my final slide that you could take away and embed into your work, and as a result, never replicate deficit discourse ever again. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, genuinely committing to a strengths-based approach is hard. It's complex, and it involves an ongoing process of unlearning and resisting the pervasive deficit discourse in research and policy that is about Aboriginal people. I can say that the first step in that process involves that word, about. A strengths-based approach to Aboriginal health requires non-Indigenous researchers and policymakers to commit to working with and alongside Aboriginal people and communities, rather than continuing to produce work that is about us but does not meaningfully involve us. A strengths-based approach requires a meaningful relationship with the population that you are working with, and perhaps more importantly, it requires the courage to say that if you can't develop those relationships, then you're not the right person to do the work, and your contribution should be helping find the person who is. I guess the one thing I'd like you to take away from this presentation is the importance of Aboriginal leadership in Aboriginal sexual health research, policy, and programs. The last time I presented this program to an audience of researchers, I was asked how those researchers could better engage with Aboriginal communities to make their research more collaborative and less extractive. And my answer to that is that in 2023, I genuinely believe we should be at the point where non-Indigenous researchers should not be seeking ways to get Aboriginal communities to support them in researching the things they want to research. Rather, they should be designing their research from the beginning around the priorities and needs of those communities and what contribution can be made to their own internal capacity to set their own research agenda. I'll close with one final video, and it's one from our current campaign that is live right now. I couldn't resist including another one of Stephen Oliver's incredible musical numbers, this time with Delara Williams as our second ambassador. I'm delighted to play it for you, and I'm so thankful to have been given the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today.
I remember the very first words they spoke. Said I needed a condom if I wanted a poke. And if I wanted a poke, that's gonna be the best. I was gonna have to go and have an STI test, and I had to say goodbye to maybe having STIs. All my poke life was gonna be dry. If if I never try to say goodbye to maybe having STIs.
So here's where to find us if you want to see more of Take Blaktion. And here are some of my references if you'd like to dive a little deeper into some of the things I've talked about today. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks so much for that presentation. I wish we could, you could probably, it's hard when you're presenting because you can't feel the emotions in the room and see the faces, but you could probably see mine throughout that brilliant presentation, smattered with all that comedy that just hits home. It's fantastic. So I think at this point, if there are people to have questions that they would like to ask Heather, please add them into the Q&A. I would like to note that we have got 97 participants, so, and I'm sure there's lots of things ticking around in your head, how you might, how this relates to the work that you're doing, any questions you have to Heather, so please type them in. In the meantime, I was wondering about your experience. So as you're saying, like, oh yeah, if you haven't thought about it before, people going, oh, why haven't we thought about this before? Like for you, you've been ruminating on it, and many of the people you work with have been having to say and give this message over and over and over again. But I was just wondering how your thoughts about how this strengths-based approach might be transferable to other communities, because at the moment for this particular presentation, you've focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities with exceptional reasons. So I was just wondering about if you had any thoughts about its transferability of this approach to other communities.
So I think strength-based approaches are really important to research and programs that focus on Aboriginal populations because of the pervasiveness of that surrounding deficit discourse when talking about Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal populations. The deficit and disadvantage is perceived as something that is really inherent to being Aboriginal and to our communities and our families and our networks. So for that reason, I feel like the strengths-based approach is particularly important for Aboriginal communities, but I definitely think it is applicable to non-Indigenous populations. There are definitely other communities and populations who are kind of analysed and interpreted through the same lens of being compared to a normed standard that is, you know, the perceived default Australian who is not an ethnic minority, not a sexual or gender minority, not a disabled person. And for those populations, I can definitely see the applicability and the importance of taking a strengths-based approach as well, because, you know, every community has strengths. Every community has things they can turn to for resilience and success. Yeah.
Thanks. So it is all about, as you're saying, constantly rethinking and reorientating the way you're approaching it and having those conversations from the very beginning and throughout the life of whatever it is that you're doing. So thanks for that. We do have quite a few questions popping up. So I'm just going to run through them. We do have a bit of time, and I thought there'd be quite a bit of interest. So the first one, and it relates to a question that I was thinking about as well, is from John about if you can give us an indication of how the comedy spots are actually being evaluated, sort of, I guess, their impact of the actual comedy element within those programs. Are they evaluated, or is it?
Yeah, so we have a partnership with the Centre for Social Research and Health to evaluate the program. And that largely consists of a longitudinal survey instrument that we have been running since the 2019 relaunch of the campaign. And it's designed to enable us to, should have prepped for this before the presentation. I haven't looked at the thing about the evaluation for a little while. So it measures changes in attitudes and behaviors to condom use, STI testing, and a few other metrics. And it's designed to enable us to compare a cohort who have been exposed to the campaign and a cohort who haven't been exposed to the campaign.
Yeah, no, that's great.
But I think it's important to note that that evaluation survey is designed to evaluate the program as a whole rather than the specific videos.
Okay.
Evaluation of the actual videos themselves rather than the broad overarching program is limited to the kind of metrics we can get out of social media analytics. So views, impressions, clicks, things like that.
Thanks. And there's another question relating to that. It was from Christy about, again, great talk. Interested to know a bit more about how those videos were collaboratively produced. So, example, did the research team hand the comedians of the brief, or how do they all work together to develop that content, or what was the approach?
Yeah, so generally our process, which we've kind of refined over the years, has been that we engage the ambassadors and the Aboriginal Advisory Committee that I mentioned, the sexual health workers who kind of provide governance and oversight for Take Blaktion. They deliver a sexual health kind of 101 training session to the ambassadors that has all the key messages and the main things they need to know in order to create the concepts. And then we have a full day scripting workshop where the ambassadors basically start off by pitching the concepts and then go off and write the scripts. The scripts then go through our internal review and approval process, and then we have a 2-day filming session. So the ambassadors are basically equipped with the subject matter knowledge to be able to bring their own expertise at writing comedy skits to the program.
So my question is around that is because it's such an impactful approach. It just it really works. But I was wondering if, and I can see how it works in the context of a campaign, like a sexual health campaign. And I was just wondering if you had ideas around how a similar approach of interweaving comedy and well-recognized, highly respected people within the community themselves could perhaps also be, that approach could be taken in the context of a research project. I don't know, through communications. We have communication plans throughout, but I'm wondering if that element of or education, awareness, whatever, do you have any ideas or suggestion around how ambassadors might be also helpful in the context of the life of a research project?
So comedy ambassadors specifically, or just community ambassadors?
I guess, it could be both, because I just see how powerful the comedy side of it is. Yeah, so just community ambassadors, and whether comedy ambassadors as part of that would work. Education, awareness, and communication.
Yeah, I genuinely haven't thought about using comedy ambassadors to communicate research findings. I think we would have to kind of explore that concept a little more deeply rather than just answering on the fly. I think it might work.
Random question. There were a couple of specific questions as well. There was one from Bridget, and she was asking if she could clarify when talking about the gaps. We should ensure that we talk about the structural drivers of the gap rather than the affected population. Does that make sense?
So when I was writing that part of the speech, what I was thinking about was a recent paper that I was a co-author on. And the analysis looked at factors associated with syphilis diagnosis. And in the initial analysis, Aboriginality was identified, Aboriginal women were identified as having a higher risk of syphilis. For women specifically, Aboriginality was identified with a higher likelihood of a syphilis diagnosis. But when we dug into that a little deeper, we found that a really significant amount of that effect was accounted for by other factors that are correlated with Aboriginality. So things like postcode and socioeconomic demographic and history of drug use and things like that. So I guess the broader point I'm trying to make is that when we're talking about, you know, disproportionate impacts of health conditions on Aboriginal people, it's sometimes much more useful to actually dig a little deeper and interrogate what is actually driving this. I just feel like identifying Aboriginality as a risk factor in isolation isn't really all that meaningful.
Yeah.
It's like there are often things that are associated with being Aboriginal that are actually more meaningful to identify as risk factors. I don't think that answered the question very well.
Bridget, who was the one that asked the question there, Bridget, if you do, I guess, have any more questions, perhaps you can contact Heather directly as well. That would be great. I'm sure she'd love to share, but it is incredibly important, as you're saying, that the top line is not enough. It's about working out what's the reason for the top line across the research. So I think there's a couple of other bigger questions and a couple of specific ones. So from Tony, thanks Heather, what are the lessons from a strengths-based approach in terms of doing the evaluations of the programs?
So evaluation is something that I've been doing, program evaluation is something that I've been doing a little bit of recently. And it sounds like just too simple, too obvious and simple, but I feel like evaluating from a strengths-based position means looking at what worked and why it worked. And when things didn't work, what could be done to make them work. And I know that sounds like a really like incredibly 101 answer, but I think a lot of program evaluation starts from a position of identifying barriers to success, and just kind of like reorienting a little to say, here's this thing we implemented, what worked about it, why did it work, what like localized strengths are there that we could draw on to ensure future success. That's
again, flipping the questions around the other way. And even when you think about sometimes when we talk about and when we describe what we're going to do, it's barriers and enablers rather than just starting off with what actually worked. That's fantastic. So there was a specific question from Positive Live. They're looking forward to sharing the presentation with them, with the rest of the team. Do you think HIV should be included in the conversation of STI testing?
This question was asked last time I did this presentation as well, and it was a we had this question as well. We raised the question internally about whether we should be incorporating more explicit HIV messaging into Take Blaktion rather than, so generally speaking in Take Blaktion, we don't talk a lot about specific infections. We talk about behaviors, because when young people are having sex with each other, they're not thinking about it in the context of a risk exposure to chlamydia or syphilis. They're thinking about it in terms of hooking up with someone hot or going on a date with their boyfriend or that kind of thing. So we had some conversations about whether we should be including more explicit messaging on HIV, and we basically concluded that we didn't have enough information to make that decision. So we engaged an Aboriginal agency to conduct some kind of comprehensive community consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and young adults. And this was not just to inform Take Blaktion, but to inform our STI and HIV programs more broadly. And we looked at a lot of attitudes and behaviours, but one of the key things that we asked the agency to investigate was whether Aboriginal young people wanted to receive messaging about bacterial STIs and HIV separately or together. And there was no consensus. So some of the young people felt very strongly that they should be considered to be the same thing because they're both sexually transmitted and you prevent them in the same way for most people. So put them together. But an equal cohort felt that HIV in the Aboriginal community still had such a legacy of fear and stigma that it kind of deserved to be talked about separately. So the conclusion that we reached was that while we're not necessarily incorporating explicit HIV messaging into Take Blaktion, that doesn't mean that we're not incorporating explicit HIV messaging into sexual health promotion programs targeting Aboriginal young people more broadly, if that makes sense.
It does, and again, the thought that you put behind answering a question like that just shows the complexity and depth of like what appears to be a fairly simple question to the enormity of the thought and consideration that needs to go behind something like that. So I think I don't think there's any other questions there. Oh, there is one here from Claire. Are you seeing much uptake of the recommendation by Thurber et al. To conduct intra-population comparisons? It's being seen much uptake of it, and if there are any risks that we should be aware of.
That's a heavy question to end on.
She's had a lot of time to think about it and type it and retype it and get it right.
I think there is work being done that uses interpopulation comparisons with Aboriginal research. I think quite frequently I see interpopulation comparisons that make me wonder what the interpopulation comparison looks like. I can't say I've been, closely monitoring uptake of the approach across research broadly. I know that sometimes I see it and I find it interesting. I know sometimes I notice when it's absent, and I question whether the analysis could have been strengthened by including it. Yeah, that's the best answer.
Yeah, no, it's definitely probably worth looking over, isn't it, as a review to see how many adopting like this, if there is a groundswell, or is there an understanding, or if it's just like a more and more people are becoming aware and thinking about how they can reorientate their questions or approach to their studies or campaigns, as you've mentioned.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before the session started, and I mean, I haven't systematically explored the answer to the question. I feel like there is an increasing adoption of strengths-based approaches, but I don't know if that's just kind of like confirmation bias as I've like explored the concept myself and become more aware of what I'm looking for. I think there would be incredible value in someone doing a systematic analysis over time to see if strength-based approaches are becoming more common, or if they're getting more attention. So over to you, researchers.
Well, I think we'll probably leave it there, Heather. And again, you've provided such thought-provoking presentation and given so many of us something to think about. You can see throughout the chat that people were really grateful for the time and for being able to hear your perspective on this, and I'm sure we'll all take a lot away. So thanks once again for agreeing to share your ideas with this group, and so there are many people in the interest that was involved. So thanks, Heather. We will look forward to seeing what happens next with Take Blaktion and with your own career. So thanks very much. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks.